Second talk of this evening is by Tom de Bruijn. He's definitely one of the organizers of Amsterdam Ruby meetup. Also, he's a fantastic senior Ruby engineer. So here you go, Tom.
Thank you. Welcome. I hope you can hear me in the back. I'm trying to speak loud, but I have a bit of COVID voice, which means been inside 2 years, not talk loud, now have to speak loud. I hope you can hear me and can see my slides. All right, yeah, like I said, I'm Tom de Bruijn. We're going to talk about DSLs, writing DSLs in Ruby, but really it's just an excuse for me to talk about some meta programming in Ruby. So what is a DSL? Well, my talk title actually already spoiled it a little bit. It stands for domain-specific language, which again doesn't really spark the imagination, so there may be more question marks here than we started. It really comes down to being a like a sublanguage that ships with either a gem or like is part of your app, and that's the domain part of the DSL. So you can write one yourself, you can ship it and make it public, but when we start, it's just a private DSL for what we make. A very common example is this rake example, where we just have a method called task, where we can define subcommands for a CLI, and then we have this block that gets executed when we call the task that has the name hello. And if we do that on the command line, it looks something like this. It's not very special, very basic as it were, but it can get a lot more extensive. This is a project I'm working on as a gem. Don't have to read everything, we'll get into it. But yeah, this is a lot more involved, and kind of the reason why I started diving into this and creating this talk. And I need to adjust one thing because I don't see the preview. Well, there I go. All right, so why do we use a DSL? Well, I've already shown a couple examples, but we usually start with something like configuration. We have a Rails app, and that Rails app has a lot of defaults, and we can change them, and one of which is the time zone or any of your custom config that you want for your app. The best part is we don't need any YAML because we're Rubyists. We write enough YAML as it is. Let's do the Ruby where we can write Ruby. And of course, Ruby, meta programming, writing a DSL, what happens is we're going to meta program more code so that we don't have to write it, but Ruby can write it for us. Again, if I take a Rails example, we have routes. We can define these routes. We have this whole file is basically the DSL, but what I think is important here is the resources. Because if we call these resources, it does a lot of magic or meta program. It creates a lot of routes for us. They just work out of the box. For all kinds of actions that we want to perform, but they also point to the right controller, and all the configuration setup, all the translation and transportation of all the data is all done for us, and it's great. But there's also, for example, this validation thing, which could also be a DSL, where we just define one validation, and then Rails will figure out, like, okay, you're creating a new object, we're going to validate it. We're going to say you're going to update it, also validate it, and whenever I call it manually. But it also has a bunch of like error message logic in there that ships for free. Great, we can use all of that. But the most important part there is that I just have to add one line. I don't have to update 5 locations to add my validation and change it and make sure it's all triggered in the right scenarios. It just works. So it really makes code that is subject to high churn, not so much high churn, because it's much easier to edit because we have to change less. If we take this example of Rake, where I'm trying to build Rake, but doesn't have all the features, hardly so, but it's, yeah, I now have a case statement that I have to edit every time I want to add a new subcommand or yeah, do anything else, but then it's very easily broken. I change one line too many, or I delete it, and now suddenly some other command that I wasn't working on doesn't work anymore. All right, so we know DSL, we know why they exist, what we can use them for. How do I write it? We usually start off with something like this. We just have a configuration object. It's fine. Like, this is where most things start. You can just pass a hash of options, and that's it. And that works. But I want to do more because I'm writing Ruby. I want to do more magic. So one of the ways you can do this is instead of giving a hash of options, which still works, of course, but we can also specify it per method call by saying verbose is true or format is documentation, which I stole from RSpec, in case you're wondering why this particular config options. And in Ruby, it kind of already ships with some DSL that does this kind of thing. If I zoom in, you see attribute accessor, which creates methods for us for reading and writing the instance variables on classes. And it just, yeah, it works. Like these options get set, and that's great. But the problem is that I now have a bunch of instance variables on my class. And if I want to like export them, like throw them to an API, and I need to collect all these instance variables again, and then throw them in a hash anyway, and why not do that directly? So what I want instead is something like this, where at the end, I can just ask, give me the list of options. So we have to change our code a little bit. That looks something like this, where we have a config class that now has an options hash, and the methods that we call set them directly on the options hash. So we have these two methods now. But the problem is, every time I add a config option, I need to add more and more methods. And now suddenly I have a very lengthy class with all these new methods. And every time I want to change one thing, I might break another, and et cetera, et cetera. So we can make this more dynamic. And one of the ways to do that is method missing. Method missing you can use in really silly ways. It's really Ruby's last way to catch any errors that might occur when a method does not exist. And in this case, I can just type random words in my file and they'll get printed. But I want to make this slightly more useful because it's fun, but it's not very useful. So I'm creating a method missing in my config class. And then I listen to a particular method signature, which is it ends with an equal sign. And then when I find this particular method signature, I set the name of the method as a config option, and then the value that was given to that method. But it may not be the best choice, because there's a couple problems with method missing. What if I call it wrong? Like, as any method, you can call it wrong. So, but if I do that with method missing, I might get a very weird error, because I'm calling verbose, and Ruby is like, you did something wrong in method missing, figure it out. I'm like, as a user that does not know how this is implemented, is completely confused and does not know where to go, and might stop using your gem. So it's unclear where methods are defined. And it breaks things like respond to, because sometimes I just want to ask, do you respond to a particular method? And method missing, the implementation will return no. But even though I call it on the line above it and I know it works. So instead, we can dynamically define our config option methods. One of the ways to do is this with this example. I'll go into it in more detail. I start off with this class method that I call, where def options define the options. These will be my options as before. I have the DSL will also be the same as before, and you can see in this slide on the bottom right. But when I call this method, it will call the method above it. We'll get a list of option names. I can loop through these option names. And then I can, per option name, can define a method that will set the option on the options hash using the method. So the next part are blocks. And if I think about DSL, and it might just be me, I think about Ruby blocks, because that was just my first experience with Rails and RSpec, I think. And it's like, oh, this is cool. I've never seen this before in another language. And it looks something like this. And if I think DSL, I think more something like this, where I have this block, I call some class method on a constant, and then stuff happens, magic happens in that block. So this is the DSL we'll continue with for a moment. How do I implement that? Well, I have a class method again, which receives a block, but is implicit, so I'm not defining it. I create a new instance of the config class, which could just be config new, but I'm already in the config class, I just call new. And then I call yield. Yield will call the block, and I can give an argument to that block, which will be the config instance, which results into this block argument that I've specified. And then I can call these methods on that config object, and then everything works as before. So this is great. We have a nice DSL. This is what I would say is a DSL because it has blocks, right? But I kind of want this. I want less code. That's just me. I want less code. I want less passing around arguments. So how do I do this? Note that I've removed the equal sign, which I'll get into later. How does this work? Well, going back to the code, creating a new method for the class method configure. Now I specify that I have a block argument because I want to do something with it, more so than just yielding it. Same logic as before. I have this created an instance object, but then I call instance eval. An instance eval is a very interesting bit of Ruby meta programming that I can use. I can change the binding of that block so that whenever it gets executed for real in this instance eval, it will actually think it is inside that instance object. So I can call the methods directly, like you saw in this example. I don't have to call anymore that I'm calling it on the config object because I'm already in it. But as I said, it doesn't work with the equal sign because Ruby will think you are assigning a local variable. And that's just how the interpreter has prioritized reading this code, is parsing this code. But it won't work if you want to actually call that method. One way to get around that is calling self, which is implicit. But now I need to explicitly tell Ruby that I want to call this method on the context of this block. And I'm getting around this particular problem that I have, and I don't like it, so let's just not. But you may ask when to use one or the other, because now you're presenting me with two options. Which is the best? It's really author's discretion. Whatever you find is most useful. You can even make it so that Ruby will check which one you're trying to do and perform that one. I won't show that, too much magic. But what I've usually seen as a pattern when I'm defining or like when I'm configuring something, I want to use an equal sign, say like, hey, I'm assigning this config option. But when I'm in a block that defines a thing or calls an action, usually doesn't have any block arguments. But there are, of course, exceptions, like the Puma gem. They just have that DSL that I like without the equal sign. Just works. They could have exposed the config object, but this also works. I am exactly on time with my talk. This is the halfway point because we have a bunch of tools. We now can define our methods dynamically based on just an array of symbols or strings. All great. And we have the Ruby blocks that, in my eyes, make it a DSL. But now we have a very small DSL that can just configure something. What if I have multiple configurations? For example, I have different levels of configuration. I have a config object, but I have an output object as well, where actually that first part should go, but I also want a top level thing that just enables or disables it. I don't want to have to implement it twice, right? We're programmers, we don't want to create more work for ourselves. So be dry, put it in a module. Same idea, just putting it in a module, calling the class methods again. How does that look? Creating a module, whenever it's included, I extend it with some class methods. This is actually what active support concerns does as well, just writing it again. And it, of course, has a instance level options method that does all the other stuff of working with the config methods. So, but I actually want this, right? I want to take it one step further and nest the config because it's actually nested config. I create a class, or I've shuffled around some code, so it's mostly the same, but now I've nested it in the way that the hierarchy works here. The real interesting part is the bottom part. We're using the same techniques as before, creating a method, giving a block, instance evaluating it if the block is given, and then run the code. And that works. That's now my example as before works. But I have two different objects now. Then I want to talk about the module builder pattern, which is a really cool pattern that gets thrown around every now and then. It's already like from 2017. It's great. I recommend you read it. If I don't convince you now, the link will show up later as well. It kind of looks like this, which the first time I saw this kind of code, I was like, I don't understand. Like I came originally from a compiled language. So I'm like, I don't understand how this would work because I'm not actually giving a module here. I'm just calling a method and somehow that works. This was the code we had before. This is just for your memory. And this is the code that actually powered the module builder. It looks very much the same, but there are some things different. We have a new module, and I have this class method define. Again, gives the option names to it. I loop through it, I define the methods, all the same. But the interesting part is that I'm actually doing this inside another module that I'm dynamically defining. And that module is, it's an anonymous module because it has no name. It is not defined to a constant. So I've just magically created a new module and thrown some stuff in at runtime, and we'll figure out what to do. And when I call this, now all this logic of creating these config methods is immediately included. I don't first have to include the configurable module. No, that's all done in the same line. So this is very portable. I just have to throw that one line in where I want it, change the method names, and we're done. And the config class doesn't need to know all that configuration for like creating the DSL for the config method. That's all part of a separate class. So separation of concerns, I'm happy. But there is a downside to this, because every now and then you run into a problem and you're like, where does this method defined? I don't know. Let's see what kind of modules are included and which module I should start blaming to figure out what went wrong. But because it's an anonymous module, it's not defined to a constant. Ruby is just like, it's a module. Go figure it out. Of course, it will point to a space in memory, like it is there, but I'm not going to figure out what that place in memory is. I'm lazy. Give me a better solution. I've changed the code a little bit around, but the thing is, I changed the method name. Can you still see that? It's getting very dark for me. So what I've changed around, this is a little bit more complicated. I'll go through it line by line mostly. This line also confuses me initially. I'm like, because there are modules and there are classes in Ruby. Why am I making a class out of a module? Somewhere this rubs me the wrong way, doesn't compute. But what I'm doing here is I'm extending module to create a new submodule that I can then initialize. This is the same as calling module new before, but now it has a name. It has config option as a name. Now, of course, in this initialize method, I will define my methods. I need to do this slightly differently because I can't break things if I just call dev there for options. But yeah, this is the same. I just do it now in an initialize method rather than the method define, I think it was called. And as you can see, the module now is a name. So now when I'm debugging, trying to figure out where this method is defined, I can see it came out of config option, and I can go on to my next step. So this is just one example of the module builder in practice. Please go read this article. It's very educational, just as like, how does Ruby work? How do you do this kind of magic? DSL objects, another topic. Again, I like my concerns separate. I like to put everything in like little boxes and make sure that they don't bite each other, or create files of thousands of lines that just become unnavigatable. How does that look? I just split all the DSL again. I have the module builder on the right. I have another method for it as well, but the interesting parts are here. I create a new config DSL instance that just is there for whenever, like in a Rails initializer, you are configuring a thing, my gem. It just returns that DSL class, and then when it's done, you can ask the DSL class, give me all the options that the user just defined, and then create my new config class with it. Because I don't need all that DSL to configure it. I just want to know what the options were. I don't need to carry all that load around for the entire runtime of the app. I don't know if that's really a memory issue, but it is confusing as a developer, like what do I call where? Yeah, another thing is modules, as we've seen before, make modules like plugins. Now we get to this original example that I showed, where I need to zoom in. I have created a plugin system for my own gem to just separate some code for like defining a label on a hash, where I don't want to use the key of that hash, but I want to, how do you say, like make a fancy label, and I don't just want to call humanize on a string and hope that it kind of looks okay. This is slightly more zoomed in as well. Like it defines just this extra config option, and it also defines DSL in that plugin itself. Because if I look at how I defined this plugin, it also uses DSL. It's just DSL is all the way down for me, where I can define which option this plugin listens to. So I trigger some internal behavior for optimization, and also define like that there is a method called label that you can give an option to. And then right there at the bottom, I have an attribute method, which is not a Ruby thing. It's just another method that I have defined that will dynamically define that method called label whenever it's included as a plugin in another library. So in summary, what are the tools that we have available? Method missing, but maybe don't use it. Define methods. They are very, you can dynamically define methods. It's very useful. Ruby blocks to make it feel and look like a DSL, at least to me. If you use yield or instance eval, up to you. Both work, both are valid. Modules, of course, make everything small, tiny modules. Do look at the module builder pattern. It's amazing. And yeah, create DSL objects just for that separation, that additional layer of separation. You can use all of these strategies together, like I showed in my little example plugin, gem, sorry. And of course, yeah, the plugins itself. So yeah, you can now build your own DSL. And I hope you've learned something. Ask me questions if you have any. Thank you.
Any questions? Hello?
Okay. Thank you. This was a really good insight on what techniques can you use. What are the best practices that you use to make these DSLs discoverable? So if somebody joins the team, how do they know what are the methods available, especially when you use instance eval? Because usually that's the hardest part. So somebody joins, how do I know what can I call? I have to go to the implementation and figure out what is the instance at that moment. Do you have best practices how to make it more intuitive?
Okay, so if I understand the question correctly, you're asking how, if you create a DSL, how do you tell your audience that this DSL exists and how to use it? Yeah. Documentation? Definitely start with that. Like everyone needs a small example, at least in the README of like, hey, how do I use this? Like Rails has a lot of guides, of course, that go into like all those different examples. Start there, definitely. You can go even further with like trying to support dynamic lookups of like, I don't know, language server plugin. I don't know. Can you maybe make the autocomplete better? That if I just call config dot and it will autocomplete whatever it finds that the methods are available on this object. You can do that kind of thing. But I'd definitely start with documentation because you need to find out what the gem author intended, how you use it. Because if I just call random methods that I know exist or look at previous examples, they may be outdated, they may be no longer relevant. So documentation.
Your documentation. Yes, you have a question.
Any downsides to it in terms of something like if somebody doesn't understand how it's implemented, they could do something like pass a block to a DSL where it would start a stack trace? I mean, it's stack overflow, for example.
So call the DSL in the wrong way and create
the wrong way and basically break the code.
Yeah, that's always possible. Yeah, you can call anything wrong and or the DSL doesn't exactly capture that scenario where like, oh, this could have been called wrong. That's always possible.
So I mean, how would you avoid having somebody call something the wrong type as an argument?
Other than using the type system of like sorbet, create checks in the method itself of like, is this a Boolean or did you meant a string or?
But then doesn't it kind of just slightly defeat, if you have to do that, doesn't it defeat the point of creating the DSL? It makes it more complicated.
For who? As the user?
For the developer of the DSL.
Yeah, you have to, I mean, we're doing meta programming. It will also always be a little bit more difficult. No, like if I use an example of like why I read this plugin or this gem, I have a very lengthy, or say like 3,000 lines of code somewhere in the code base. And if I do this in just, because it was all hashes, it was all defined, and it's also very fragile because now there is no DSL. I can just define the hash whatever I want, and if it doesn't work, it is silently ignored because there are no checks on these hashes unless I write them again. Okay. So the DSL is, I think, slightly better because if you call something that does not exist, you get an error. Where if you define something on a hash that was replaced by this DSL, then it's just silently ignored unless you check exactly.
So you're enforcing a more rigid structure.
Yeah, okay. At least I think that's better.
Yeah.
Mulder.
Yeah, it's sort of going on with the last question, like, are there any tricks yet that you know of implementing a type system in such a DSL? Like, can you enforce like sort of, for example, verbose must be true, so it must be a Boolean. Can you already set that in your DSL somehow? Do you know something like that exists?
No, I think you have to write that yourself, probably. Or just whenever this method is called, like I had another example, but this was coming very long, where I just defined two methods of like def options and def options bool, where it behaves slightly differently. You can make a different implementation. You can have like Rails has the thing like add a question mark or add a exclamation mark, and like if you call an exclamation mark, it will set to true. If you use the question mark, it will give a Boolean back. So you need to define them in slightly different ways. I'm just using the simple example of like just throw anything you want at it, but you can, of course, extend your DSL and make, for these different types. But you still need to implement those checks.
Okay.
As you know, as Rails and Ruby developers, there's a lot of gems and a lot of Rails things that already provide DSLs, and some of which everyone loves, some of which are highly contested, like RSpec.
Yeah.
My question is, what is your personal opinion of too much magic, and how do you think, which approach should we take to not become RSpec when we write our own DSL?
Hello.
Kind of gave it all away.
It's always fun that you're around here, John.
All right. I should not have removed the RSpec slide. I see that. I like RSpec.
I know you.
But RSpec is definitely flawed. It's not perfect. If I look at Minitest, I'm like, this is great, but also I like the spec DSL of Minitest better. There's definitely too much going on in RSpec, I feel. I've tried to do a couple things in it once and gave up as like a developer contributor. So I worked on documentation website instead. Anyway, too much going on. I would advise against going that far. In my examples are just like configuration, or like in my case, like I want to wrap around a hash to make it slightly more usable. So know when to quit. It's very tempting if you're getting into this. They're like, oh, all these shiny, cool tools. What can I make? And my plugin system kind of felt like that sometimes, but then the upside is a lot of less code that I have to write. But you have to all maintain that, of course. So yeah, again, author's discretion. Try and hold yourself back in your enthusiasm. Again, I think RSpec is a great tool, but there's too much going on.
Okay, so let's not get high on our own supply. Bess, did you have a question?
Yeah, just sort of meta responding to Wander, responding to the front there. Meta programming, it's just code, generating code, generating code, generating code, generating code. It's DSL's always done.
Yeah.
So if you want a type system, add a type system point in the DSL stack where it's relevant. Because in the end, it's just parameters passed through methods that you can do stuff with. So if you want to annotate it and add a type system, just add more parameters that help you define types.
I see some people are going to have a drink later. And then I think we have time for one other question. Yes, hello.
Hello, no question about DSL, but which union?
There is a Slack that I'm part of, or try to be. Time is a problem. I can share the link, but you have to get vetted a little bit. But there is no union that I know of for tech workers in the Netherlands. We should make one. Because if some guy with 44 billion comes into your office and buys the place, you suddenly have a job security problem. So think about it.
There is one.
Yeah, there is one? Then I have not heard that.
Isn't it?
I'm not.
Okay.
Okay. Which one?
Anyway, so that being the last question, I think this is where we round up and have a round of applause for Tom de Bruijn.